Interesting thoughts from one of our questioners there, Jacqui Taylor. So Jacqui is actually an appointment to the Cabinet Office on open data. So she deals with serious numbers. So that billion that was mentioned earlier, 3 billion, she's not scared by that kind of stuff. So she's going to talk us through perhaps the bigger picture around data. So over to you, Jacqui. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. I'm not the normal speaker for this conference, but I'm a web scientist. I'm CEO of FlyingBinary, and we're dealing with opening up the web for what you all do to be game-changing. So we're the innovation front edge of all of that, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. It's great to be with a crowd of people that are actually leading this stuff, and I want to show you what we're up to and what the future we're planning is. So I think the key phrase I want to say is this particular piece that I'm talking about is right now, absolutely right now. We're at a tipping point from a data point of view and from a web point of view. Just a little bit about my company, because again, most people won't have heard of us, although I know I've got a few tweet friends in the room. And we took the first UK financial services company to the cloud, and we did disruptive analytics. And on the back of that, we formed a company to say data is actually what it's all about. As Luke said, I'm appointed to the Cabinet Office on the Open Data Agenda, and we transformed the nature of that conversation last Friday and put up a roadmap of what data looks like and what transparent government process is. And that caused a few eyebrows to be raised and lots of conversation around that, and that's just the start. I'm a Tech City mentor. I've mentored startups in Tech City and growth companies particularly for the last 2 years. And Tech City, in case you're wondering, doesn't exist. It's a virtual city, the first virtual city on Earth, that obviously has physical locations, but digital is its home and digital is what it is, and it makes the most of the web. And we supply our cloud and analytics services to Her Majesty's Government under something called the G-Cloud programme, which is transforming, from a citizen point of view, our interaction with the UK government. But I want to talk to you about context of all of this, and lots of things Luke said this morning and things that Katie was saying, particularly what I feel I should apologise for not being called Katie today, but for what Katie Payne said as well. I want to frame that in the context of the World Wide Web, my world, my web world, which obviously is the infrastructure that everything sits on we're talking about today. As a web scientist, we talk about the Web 1.0, and that's 21 years ago. So Tim Berners-Lee, who leads the web science movement across the world, sat in CERN, connected two protocols, which are very boring if you're not a technologist, but actually put the first website live and essentially said, "Hello world." And at that point, and up until relatively recently, what we had was these essentially brochure sites. We had, if you had a complex website, you had something with comments on. That's like, wow, at the time. And the conversations that were going on at that time were, why would we have a website? I don't want a website in the boardrooms of the world. Those people, they're the sort of the strange companies. We won't do that. That's not what we'll do. But of course, the world moved on. And so the Web 2 world that we're generally talking about over these 2 days is what we tend to call the Google world. The rise of SEO, the era of social platforms, where you don't have to explain to your CEO, yes, you do need to spend that amount of money, we do need a website, and even if our 10 nearest competitors aren't doing it, we need to do it, because that's not where we are. Nobody asks that question anymore. Nobody looks at it like that. From a web science point of view, we're working in the Web 3 world, and that's a completely new era, and that's where the opportunity and excitement is from a point of view of what the possibilities are. Because this is where we're talking about the human connection, we're talking about the infrastructure of the social web actually enabling the human connection. And that's why this conference is really important, because measurement and monitoring is actually the foundation stone of everything we do. And we might still be having to have the conversations Katie talked about in the boardrooms. We might have to frame those conversations well. We might have to explain ourselves. But the website is no longer enough. Social media has to be blended with that, with lots of other things that I'll talk about and explain the sort of innovations that are going on. So essentially, we're actually just at the beginning. So we're no longer saying we need to do something with social media. We're actually saying, well, what will we do? What makes a difference? What for our company, our brand, as an individual, does it mean to me? But I want to frame that first in, we've only got 20% of the world online, so we really are at the beginning, predominantly English speaking, and predominantly Gen Y. And the generation piece is something I want to come on to, because that fundamentally affects how we do what, as a web scientist, I generally speak on, which is how do we profit from the web? How do we engage with the web? What is that all about? What does it mean to us? And the generation piece is really important, because Generation Y have been born into prosperity, with many terms about who these people are. Millennials is what they're generally called. And they follow the Generation X, which when they were the baby boomers, they came post the war struggle, and they were in a different generation. They had different things that they needed to achieve. And they wanted to secure the world. So interested to see information security, because that, from a cybersecurity point of view, is very much my arena. So their view of the whole world was command and control. We need to secure it, we need to lock it down, and that's where we've been. But Gen Y don't think like that. They're an open, collaborative generation. The key thing about them is they're a visual generation. So some of the things we've already touched on today, the visual piece of this is most important. So this just happens to be out of a workbook from a client in the fast-moving consumer goods arena. And these sorts of charts and the infographics that Luke put up are generally what we're seeing around today. And the reason is Gen Y is coming into the workforce and has demanded this, because they're not an auditory generation like Gen X. They're a visual generation. Now, this is a static chart, and it doesn't mean anything to you without the context, but the key thing about this is whatever you're using to display your information, to curate those conversations, to influence your own brands, your own companies, understand that within 4 years, Generation Y will be predominant in the workforce. So the rise of the visual and the way that we look at data, the way we analyse things, is actually, this is here to stay. And so the more that you do with this visual piece, the more important that'll be for getting your message across. I need to talk about Generation Z, because I'm at Southampton University, part of the doctoral training team, an industry partner, working on the research arenas. But I also have another research area, which is 1,000 of the Generation Z children. They're the web generation. They're the 1993 generation. And they started coming into the workforce last year. And that's very important, because they transform what I've just said about visual, because they move it on a huge leap. They're what we term a kinesthetic generation. Now, if you're an actor, people say to you, don't work with children and animals. If you're a web scientist, you never depend on an internet connection. So I'm not going to do this live, but I am going to show you a video. And essentially, I'm hoping that will work actually. This is a map of the world where there's selections being made. This was something we did for the peace organisation, CIPRI. We worked with The Guardian in terms of getting data out there and telling stories. And this is tracking what somebody actually did when they looked at how much of my country's GDP is spent on arms. When you consider the economic downturn that's going on across the world, the question that citizens of the world are asking is, why am I spending any GDP on arms? Why should that not be redeployed? And so essentially this interactivity, but also interactivity that is controlled by you. So this is a kinesthetic generation that are able to tell the home story, the thing that we put on the webpage, obviously, but then actually make their own story about it. And this is literally saying, this is the way it will be. And back to the homepage as it was displayed in The Guardian, the key thing being, on the continents, this is a spend, and as you drill through it, part of that video showed you the Nicaraguan spend, which actually caused the president of Nicaragua to explain himself and that data within Parliament. So using data, obviously this is not sentiment data, but it's data that can be blended with sentiment. So we could have actually put sentiment with this as well. But it's displaying the idea that we need to move to an interactivity in what we're doing. I briefly mentioned we changed the conversation for the UK government a couple of weeks ago. This is what changed it. Obviously this is interactive too. But this is the open data roadmap, what we're going to do, what we've committed to do as a government, and this is the first time ever that the demand for open data has been led by a community. So what this roadmap shows is that the most requests we've had are from individuals. They're starting to engage with this. We actually have a button on there that says get some data that you need to. We actually have a button that says get this data, you play with this data and share it. But the key thing that this is about is transparently making government data accessible, usable and consumable by everybody, whether they're a data scientist like my team that built this or somebody that's engaged with it. So we're moving on in terms of what the web is capable of and how we're using it. So finally get to the subject that you're here to talk about. Thing I want to say is I love the slide that you gave, Luke, because that platform, I mean, as a web scientist, I look at that infographic and think, oh no, because that's the landscape of all the platforms. You think, how can anybody make sense of that? But it's a great slide because it says it's mainstream. And those such social platforms are enabling engagement, and we can argue about the numbers and all the rest of it. But what it tells me is the land grab is going on, and there's a scramble to provide metrics. And this definition, Katie touched on it, on return on investment. Yeah, I absolutely agree, Katie. Never use that word. If somebody actually pins me down about ROI, I said, oh yeah, return on influence. That's what we talk about in the social media world. We don't talk about return on investment and then move away from any financial conversation that's going to get you in huge amount of trouble with the CFO. Want to talk about some of the movements that are blended in with what's going on. Obviously, Arab Spring was a challenge to governments in a particular region, but actually, whether you know it or not, it was a challenge to governments across the world. And we have 58 nations round a table. The UK chairs that. It's called the Open Government Partnership, looking at how to cooperate on change. So governments are understanding that what's going on in social media has influence on the ground and at our national boundaries. And what we've already had as a result of some of the open data work that's gone on is policy being set by people and governments actually implementing policy as opposed to governments setting policy. And that, you know, obviously I showed that with the open data, but the Open Government Partnership is a foundation for that, and there's some real change going on. I can't stand up here without mentioning this. Obviously we're going to look at this later today. When I talk about the web is neutral. It brings out humanity. People show you who they are. Things like this bring out the worst of humanity. The thing that people that do this stuff need to understand is the web's a fabric of permanence. You've done it once, you'll never be forgiven. And I'll talk about that now because I framed the Gen Y, Gen Z conversation because this is one of the issues that we look at most, that part of the research we're doing at Southampton and the other doctoral training centres on this is trust is a huge issue in terms of whatever you're doing on the social platforms, whatever you're doing on the social web, you need to understand how that works. Because the Gen X version and values that are around trust are not true for Gen Y and not true for Gen Z. Gen Y and Gen Z are particularly unforgiving for anything like this. So from a brand and a community point of view, it's really key that this isn't done. And obviously it's being ignored, but it'll be a short-term gain. But because of that fabric of permanence, you'll never get away from it. Your brand's always tainted by it. So we as web scientists, and obviously you in your roles, need to resist that at all costs. Because the thing that we're moving towards as Gen Y become predominant in the workforce over the next few years, Gen Z actually established trust in a completely different way. So we're starting to see the pushback on brands and on people when they're found to be untrustworthy. But Generation Z don't actually establish trust anyway across the social web other than via their own networks. So you can tell them anything, but they'll check you out. And unless their curated networks agree with you, they just won't believe you. So we move finally from that command and control structure. This is a visualization, which again is interactive, that we did for the Edelman Trust, because as part of this whole Arab Spring, looking at the way democracy works, etc., they looked at curating data to understand the trust. How is that perceived across the nations? How do people perceive it? And the interesting thing for us as web scientists was every government around the world across those 2 years of 2011, 2012 saw declining trust. Declining trust in businesses and even in NGOs. But the trust in media increased because people are actually looking elsewhere for how they define this, what they do, what they decide to believe in, who they follow. And that's very much the influence of what we're all engaged with from a social media point of view. And when I talk to clients about what they're doing with data, big data, open data, whichever, I talk to them about something called social business. And this is a philosophy that says everything you're doing in social media, I completely agree with Katie, has to be driven from the objectives. It has to be set in context. But what you do have is a data ecosystem already sat in brands and companies and corporations across the world. And that can be developed to actually blend the two together. There are many heterogeneous data sources from everywhere, including open data, including perhaps things that you can crowdsource. And you can blend that with the social data to create relevant data for you. So what companies are starting to do over the last year is pull that together, look wider than their walls, forget the firewalls in these contexts. Now, obviously, it helps we're cloud specialists because they're not actually going to let this inside the firewall. I think you probably understand why that would be. So we put these up on cloud infrastructures to actually explore and research and explain all of this whilst we develop their social business. And what that is all about is understanding how to profit from this web. How do you extend the value of what you have as social media data with everything else you have? And that sees the walls that have completely tumbled for us as a company over the last 18 months is the idea there's an internal comms and an external comms, because there just not anymore. When companies understand social business and they understand that there's a profit to be made from this and they can realign their business values and they essentially do some research and we help them frame that, we help them through that discovery piece. But the interesting thing to me over the last 18 months while we've been doing this is the key people in the teams that we build inside of companies to take account of this are the social media specialists. And we've actually built everything we've done around the existing social platforms that are already in the company. Because the resources are there, it's a matter of how you use them and what you're aligning it to. And because you're doing it on the basis of what's already in there, it's not seen as such an innovation. But of course, once you create that landscape of social business, then it can be extended and all the engagement that you've got on the web can be brought into that. So it's a way of framing the social conversation at boardrooms where it's less threatening to the Gen X who are still generally in charge, and it actually allows us to do our social media philosophy and build what we're building, but it aligns everything together. So what I really wanted to talk to everybody today about is it's a huge opportunity, definitely is, and over the next 4 years, this meantime before we move into Generation Y being in charge of the workforce, is actually going to be aligned with another change. As web scientists, we will ensure that the next 60% of humanity joins the social web. So over the next 4 years, 5 billion additional voices will be on that web. And whatever we think works now, you can imagine exploding it to that population. It's going to redefine everything. So it's great to see the standards and things that Katie's doing and the fact that you're all in this room, because in 4 years' time, we've got a global marketplace connected. And obviously that's 80% of the world, and you know, as Tim Berners-Lee said at the Olympic opening ceremony, it's for everyone. We do know there's 20% not with that, but you can form a change across the world, you know, where Arab Spring looks lightweight if you've got 80% of humanity connected on there. But then people say, well, I think it's a threat. Yeah, it is actually a threat. It's a threat to that command and control world. It's a threat, it's something that will impact everything we do. But social media is the key to this whole piece, which is why I wanted to be here today. So whilst you're looking at what you're looking at, the wider world is very much supporting and developing an ecosystem around you. Now I have to put this up here because I'm so fed up with big data. So fed up. I had one of the Gartner analysts call me and say, Jacqui, big data's over. Thank the Lord for that one then. What's new? Open data. Oh no. So Doug Laney, I spoke to Doug Laney, who originally invented the 3 Bs of big data, and he said, Jacqui Taylor, you're talking about 8 Bs of big data. What are you talking about? And I said, look, at the end of the day, we as specialists have to work with people to get these innovations done. And our 8 Vs of big data, or data as we call it, our 8 Vs of data are the 8 Vs that matter the company objectives, that get innovation, that get change, that make them more successful. And volume is the least important one. You know, if we have one of our clients has a cloud service with 24/7 analytics with 10 petabytes in the cloud, wow, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's just, so big data, it's data for us. Now, everything I've talked about in terms of this blended approach, this new social business idea, it's a positive impact generally on the P&L, whether it's a saving, whether it's adding things in. And you finally can sit down and talk to the CFO in the numbers that he wants and do it in the way he wants, frame it in his context, but social is the key thread for this. There's new approaches to campaigns that are possible, new channels of income. And one of the things that we're seeing from when I said this, the key people within this innovation within companies of being the social media specialists, is there's like an advisory board set up happening across these companies, of which they're seeded by the social media specialists. And those advisory boards are complementary to what's going on in the boardroom and, you know, looking after the shareholders. But it's like an evangelical or you know, some sort of champion board where it's understanding this, knowing that we're at the beginning of all this and it needs to be explored. However, social media specialists are comms specialists, and they rarely love or are proficient in numbers. My data scientists are wonderful people, but they're rarely good communicators. We have a couple that you know, trounce that one. But so what we've had to do in order to create this sort of new world is develop shared skills, understand that the relationship between the words and the numbers people needs to be brought together, and we create what we call SWAT teams, which they all love being the SWAT team. And they're a hybrid team, really. So if I can give you an example of a publishing company, 30,000 people that are working in this arena, pull 52 of them out, bring them together, retrain them all, find 3 data scientists. But then, again, the key thing in there is numbers and words people and social media people actually directing operations. And I wanted to just show you this, which I can't in any way name or say what it's about in terms of but it shows what's possible. Now this is a mobile brand who understand that when we switch on the next 60% of the web, then their mobile brand becomes a completely different thing. And the 2 big orange dots that you see there are what they were doing about that. They were like, we've done this stuff out on the social web, we've done our engagement, what do you think? They're like, yeah, you might be doing that, but you see all these other dots, and can you have a look at South America? There's a great big red dot there. And when we explained what that was all about, by blending together what they had inside of the firewall, understanding what the platforms were bringing, and then bringing some intelligence on top of that, then the sales team were very grateful to me that they were on the next plane to South America. Because, and the key to that particular change in that company was the social media specialists. They understood that. They could work with the data analysts and the domain specialists within the change and the innovation in that company. But they were the key to saying, what does this need to do? What do we need to measure? How do we bring it together? So, I've said it a number of times, but this is genuinely what I believe. You're part of a spearhead of change that's going on. We as web scientists are doing our best to enable. And if you hear all the big data conversations, this is the thing that you tend to hear all the time. Oh, data's the new oil. Yeah, I agree with that. And but what I would say is, if data's the new oil, then I actually think that social data is the new petroleum, and that's why it's very important what you're doing and this conference and what this is all talking about. Now, obviously, I've had to make it fairly generic, and I'm around the rest of the day if anybody wants individual questions about where they are and what they're doing. But I'm happy to take questions now, obviously. But thank you for listening.